It's an honor to be here. My good friend was here last year, Professor Rupert Lewis,
Yes, yes, I
and
remember.
I'm glad to follow in his footsteps. And I'll try to do my best, and I think I'll do my best in talking about Garvey and his philosophy and its the relevance and importance of
Right,
Garvey
right, right.
in the 21st century. So I'm at the University of the West Indies in Mona, Jamaica, and there I taught a course on Garveyism in the Americas and Africa.
Right, right.
So I'm quite familiar with the works of Garvey's political activity and uh, and the influence of Garvey.
Right.
It's probably the most influential person of African descent in the entire 20th century, and his influence continues today.
Right, right, right.
So, for example, the Rastafari movement in Jamaica was founded by Garveyites,
Right, right, right.
and it's the condition prepared by Garvey that led to the formation of the Rastafari movement
Right.
when Rastafari was crowned Haile Selassie the First in 1930. So that's one influence.
Sorry, sorry.
Of course, another influence along this line of black movement with a spiritual base
Sorry, sorry.
is the Nation of Islam.
Sorry.
The founder of the Nation of Islam was a Garveyite. And the most prominent person in the Nation of Islam in the 1960s was Malcolm X,
Right,
whose mother and father were Garveyites.
right,
In
right.
fact, I went to his mother's house, well, where the house used to be.
In Boston or somewhere.
No, not one. Before she came to the United
Oh,
States,
in Grenada.
in Grenada,
Yes,
I
yes.
went there just about 2 months ago
Right.
to photograph the spot where the house stood and to speak to people in the community about what they know about her.
Right, right,
Right, so that's another Garvey influence. Garvey had a very important influence on Malcolm X.
right. Right, right.
He had a very important influence on Martin Luther King.
Right.
He himself spoke about it.
Right.
Right? Um, he had an important influence on a number of African leaders in the struggle for national liberation. First amongst them is Kwame Nkrumah, who said that the best book he has ever read is The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And in fact, in the Ghanaian flag, because he became the first leader of an independent Ghana, and the Ghanaian flag, there's a black star indicating the Black Star shipping company, line shipping company that Garvey initiated. Um, Other African leaders that in that time that he had a very important influence on was Jomo Kenyatta.
Yes.
In fact, one of the Negro World, one of the newspapers of the UNIA, which was edited by Garvey, it was taken around the world by black sailors, and it reached places like South Africa and Kenya on the eastern coast of Africa. And in fact, what happened is that a number of persons who could read would read the newspaper to runners, and they would recite what they have read, what they heard read, and they would then go miles away into different communities and recite what they have heard to people who were in groups all across Kenya.
Right,
And
right.
that's the influence of Garvey. Had a tremendous influence on the direction of the African National Congress in the 1920s, when especially black leaders from the trade union movement in the ANC, some of whom were Garveyites, helped to develop during that time the African National Congress. And of course, other black leaders like Ezekwe were very influential. Garvey influenced them a lot.
Even from other nations outside, well, other races of people as well, I've heard.
Well, certainly Garvey supported, for example, the National Liberation Movement in Ireland, right? He supported the Fians, the group that led the National Liberation Movement at the time. He supported the National Liberation Movement in India, and even the Chinese national movement at the time in the 1920s. They recognized the work of Garvey. Garvey supported the revolution in Russia in 1917, which led to the formation of the Soviet Union. In fact, Garvey urged black people when he was in the United States then that what Lenin did for Russia, that black people need to do it for Africa, to throw off colonial rule. So that Garvey was very influential. Now, his influence in Jamaica, I talk about Rastafari movement. It is the Rastafari movement that carried the name of Garvey in their music in a very popular way. Don Drummond, one of the greatest trombonists, was a Garveyite. Burning Spear, who wrote and sang a number of songs about Garvey. Peter Tosh, Bob Marley. In fact, Bob Marley said that his role in the world is to make the Garvey revolution. Right? So the Rastafari movement, of which these persons were a part of, actually were instrumental in carrying on the legacy, the philosophical and political legacy and psychological legacy of Marcus Garvey from that time to this time.
Right. I want to ask you, okay, now that we have fast forward to this time, what is it can we do, with Marcus Garvey message? What is it that link that we're missing for us to now come out of the condition that we're in right now?
Well, first of all, the philosophy of Garvey is worth understanding. Garvey's view was that we have to think for ourselves. We cannot use the philosophy of white supremacy to guide our struggle and to look into our future. He said that it's a philosophy that has to be Pan-Africanist. And it's also a psychology that is rooted in African experience. While at the same time arguing that the best of all humankind must be sourced as part of our struggle for freedom. So he was very clear that Eurocentrism, the belief system of Europe, that class African in a certain way, that we still have problem with today. In the United States, for example, under this regime, it is still a big problem, and that the belief system of the oppressor is unable to help to liberate Africans. And therefore, I say that in order to say that the education system is a big source of perpetuating that belief system. And black families in Jamaica, and it's a problem in Jamaica, throughout the Caribbean and the United States, and in Africa, need to ensure that this is an education system that does not perpetuate what Garvey called mental slavery. And hence, is 1927 view and charge to people of African descent to emancipate themselves from mental slavery. Because while other people can free the physical body, they cannot free the mind. It is African and people of African descent duty to get rid of mental slavery, so as to free the mind from the vestiges and the encumbrances of the type of philosophy that made them want not to be themselves. Which then developed a level of distrust amongst Africans. Not trusting themselves, and so on. So that is one of the most important things that in which Garvey and his philosophy are relevant in the 21st century. The other thing is unity. For example, there's a lot of division amongst people of African descent. A lot of division. And Garvey's charge of unity is very important. Let me give you an example. In the United States, the earnings of African Americans is equivalent to the economy of Brazil.
That's deep.
Yet, what happened is that earning is circulated amongst African Americans but once. And therefore, African Americans cannot really build wealth on that basis. And it requires a level of unity in order to do that. In order to recognize that while we need to buy from everyone, but to develop an economy that is centered around the experience of Africans. That in the same way they were able to move themselves politically in order, for example, for the issue of reparations to be raised in the Congress of the United States. That type of unity that allowed them to determine who is nominated as presidential candidate and ultimately as president. That the same needs to be done in relation to the economy. It is very important. Because for the entire years, centuries of enslavement, people of African descent were deprived of ownership of the means of production, of the means of their own livelihood. All of the years of Jim Crow was dedicated to that. Right? And absolutely. Plus the promise of 40 acres on a mule, which in a sense would be a reparations, was denied. They reneged on it. In Jamaica and the British Caribbean, it was the planter class, the slaveholding classes, who were paid. They were paid 20 million pounds in 1834 for what they call the loss of their stock. And money was borrowed by the British Parliament to pay that. Guess what? The British Parliament only finished paying off that debt in 2015. 2015.
That was just about a few years ago.
4 years ago.
But when we ask for our reparations, is move on. It was a long time ago, but they just finished paid off the British. This is crazy.
But they move on. They have not moved on. What?
We must move on, but they have to.
They have not moved on because they want to embrace all the legacies that slave labor created for them. Right? So for example, one of the biggest banks in the world is Barclays.
Yeah.
Barclays Bank was developed by two slave traders.
Right, right, right.
The profit that they made from selling Africans was used to establish Barclays Bank.
Right, right,
Today, one of the biggest banks in the world. And there are examples
right.
in the United States. Many examples.
One thing I wanted to ask you. I was just reading about a reparations that I think it was the university. They got reparations for black people or for the university for 20 million. Talk to me a little bit about that. I feel that that was a little bit of money, but talk to me. Give me a little more in depth in that.
20 million pounds.
Right.
Glasgow University. Scottish University. That came about first through the initiative in raising the issue by the Chancellor of the University of West Indies, Professor Hilary Beckles.
Right, right,
It was raised with Glasgow. They had meetings and so on.
right.
What is behind that? Well, Glasgow, from the days of slavery, benefited a lot from funding from planters in Jamaica and other British Caribbean, but it's Caribbean territories, especially from Jamaica. They benefited by their children going to Glasgow or themselves going to Glasgow and donating over a period of time millions of dollars in today's world to Glasgow University. It's a recognition of that and the sense of justice seen by the current leadership in Glasgow that allowed that to happen.
Okay, I just want to be clear. That 20 million is only for them, the school. This is not Caribbean people getting back black people, a whole entire black people getting back money. It's just for them who owe that particular company.
Clear. Just to be clear, reparations for people of African descent in the Caribbean is calculated by some in trillions.
Okay.
So let us be very clear about that.
Okay, so that's just
Let's be very clear of that.
Okay, good.
It is for UII to develop certain programs. For example, they are thinking of developing a school that as a part of the medical school. UII has a very good medical school.
Right. Yes.
To study ailments affecting black people. For example, hypertension,
Right.
high blood pressure, diabetes,
Right. What's about mental
which
illness too?
which that is part of it. Which yes, that's part of it. Which has been asserted to have stemmed from the type of diet enslaved Africans in the Caribbean were subjected to. High salt content for centuries. Right?
To the point it has become hereditary too now.
To the point where it is transmitted from generation to generation.
Yes.
In fact, take for example Ghana, where many of the enslaved Africans came from, to Jamaica.
Right.
The level of hypertension in Ghana is normal, like the rest of the world.
Right.
In the Caribbean, it is one of the highest level of hypertension amongst black people.
Right.
And you don't find that in Ghana. Right? The level of hypertension in the United States amongst black is exceedingly high as well.
I could contest to that because I have a lot of family.
Yes.
I have a lot of family who have high blood pressure.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, it aligns with the generation now, so we could see what you're saying is very true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Right. So that agreement with Glasgow University is in relation to things like this.
Right. Side. Okay.
Right?
Okay. I can get that.
Yes. And by the way, I said that the British paid the slaveholders.
Right.
But guess what? there's even a more terrible case. Because the British case, the more terrible case is Haiti, which is 100 miles east of Jamaica. The Asian people overthrew the French,
Right. And they have to
defeated the three mightiest armies in the world: the French, the British, and the Spanish.
Right.
And in the process, lost 40% of their population
Right. Oh,
to be free from slavery.
right.
And when all of that is done and they declare independence, and the French threaten to retake it, which they did with Guadeloupe,
Guadeloupe, yeah.
right? They actually reimposed slavery in Guadeloupe,
Right.
another French island where slavery was abolished. When Napoleon came to power, he sent troops back to destroy the Haitian Revolution.
Right.
And the Haitians under Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, defeated the French. Right? And that's how Haiti declared independence. And then in 1825, to avoid the French and other European powers from coming back to Haiti to overthrow slavery, the French said, we will recognize you if you paid us to the tune of 150 million gold francs.
Wow.
It was so odious. Even the French recognized that that was unpayable. So they reduced it in 1838 to 90 million gold francs.
Right.
And the Asian government from 1825 to 1947
Right.
paid that money
So,
by borrowing from a designated French bank
right.
and incurring debt to pay for their freedom.
Right. So that's insult to injury.
No, but one of the arguments today is that, well, we today had nothing to do with slavery, so I don't see why we should pay
That's
reparation.
what a lot of
Generations of Asians who did not fight for Asian freedom
Right.
had to pay
Right.
that pay reparations in reverse
Right.
for their freedom
Right.
up to 1947, right? So one of the most important issues in relation to freedom and justice, talk about transitional justice going forward, is definitely the issue of reparation.